So I am now recording. So since I just started record, I'm going to go ahead and take us back for the agenda. Folks, we're going to do an overview. We're going to talk about your path to victory. We'll discuss your toolkit, people power. We'll do a debrief, and then we will do questions at the end. Once again, folks, if you do have questions, please leave them in the chat and we'll get to those at the end. All right, folks, so let's get to work. All right, folks, so let's talk about why this matters. So essentially, folks, for decades, political campaigns have had, two primary options for direct voter contact. It's been your call, so hitting the phones, and we've been knocking doors. But folks, as we've seen with this pandemic, there are certain things we just could not do this cycle. So while your phone calls and your door-to-door canvassing, if you can, is still essential organizing tactics, peer-to-peer texting has really emerged to being a critical third option, if not the first primary option, I'm going to say. So folks, texting is a really efficient and incredibly effective way to reach out to voters, to reach supporters, or even recruit people. Now, more often than not, folks, you will get folks at least 90% of the time who will actually open up your messages. So that means you have a really extremely high contact rate when you are sending text peer-to-peer. All right, folks, so we're going to talk about building your path to victory. Now, folks, there are a multitude of peer-to-peer texting programs that you're able to use to meet your program needs. So essentially, all of these platforms primarily function the same, but there are varying features and price points for each of these programs, folks. Now, you always want to make sure that you are shopping around to really find the best platform for your program. So you really should consider a couple things. One, consider what your budget is. Also, consider the platform's capacity. So can it handle X amount of text in a set period of time, right? So can it handle 2 million texts in 1 hour? Or can it handle a certain amount of volunteers texting all at the same time? So really kind of consider how big your platform may be or your program may be to help you think about which texting platform you want to use. Now, for example, based on our programmatic needs, we actually use Through Text, folks. So this is a subset of Get Through. So some of you may be familiar with this peer-to-peer texting program. It was formerly called Relay, for those of you who texted with Relay in the past. So folks, you also have the option, if you do have access to, in-house developers, these people can actually build you a peer-to-peer texting tool as well. So that is an option for you. Actually, we had the pleasure of having that this time. So our in-house team developed a peer-to-peer tool, which was called Pencil. And so this served as our backup peer-to-peer texting tool. And we use this just in case any technical issues, may come about. And folks, that is something that can happen. So it's always really good to have a backup if you can fit that into your budget. Now, folks, we did not use Pencil often, but we did successfully send 8.5 million texts. So that just goes to show that when you have a backup tool, it will function the same way, and you will still be able to do some scalable work with another platform. All right, folks, so we're going to talk a little bit about your goals. So when you are building your pathway to victory, it's really important that you understand what peer-to-peer texting can do for you and your program. So it can be used for a lot of different purposes. So you can use it for volunteer recruitment, event turnout, voter ID, getting out the vote. You can do fundraising, thanking donors. There's just a whole lot of different things, folks, that you can do with peer-to-peer texting. For our particular program, folks, we did a lot of focus on volunteer recruitment, event turnout, of course, voter ID, and some GOTV work. So for this program, we didn't necessarily need to focus so much on fundraising or thanking donors, but that is something that you have the capacity to do. Now, also, when you are thinking about those goals, folks, think of it like this. Whatever you can say in person, whatever ask you can make in person, you can definitely make via text. All right, folks, so we are going to set our foundation and really start building. So in this moment, folks, I really want you all to take a step back and think of your program that you're building as a construction site, right? And you folks are going to be the engineers of that construction site. Now, before you're able to begin building, you have to set your foundation, right? So we're going to need to create a blueprint. So there's a couple of things, folks, that you really want to consider. So the very first, folks, is what is your budget? So knowing your budget is going to determine a lot of different things. For example, your staffing capacity, what platform will you be able to use, right? Also, you want to think about what type of outreach is going to be needed to accomplish your programmatic goals. So just a second ago, folks, we talked about the ways that you can use peer-to-peer texting. So are you going to need to do volunteer recruitment? Are you needing to do voter ID? So think about what type of outreach is going to be needed in order for you to reach your goals. And then also think about how many targets you're trying to reach. So how many people do you need to contact successfully? You can also think about how many times will you need to reach out to these folks to get in touch with them. Also, you want to think about your volunteer base. If you already have a current volunteer base, go ahead and think about how large it is now, and then what are your recruitment goals in the future. You also want to consider what tasks can be delegated to your volunteers to free up your staff time, right? Also, folks, it's really important that you think about how you're going to define your successes and your failures so that you're able to measure your program. All right, so let's actually talk about the building blocks. So folks, targeting the correct audience is really going to be essential to your texting program. So you want to think about this, if you're the engineer, as your building blocks, right? This is going to be the materials that you use to build up your construction building, whatever you're building. So first things first, folks, you want to kind of think about your scripting, right? So how will your scripts be different for people based on the lists? Will you be using generic script writing? What type of messaging standards will you be using, folks? Or also think about who you're targeting so that you can make sure that the messages you're sending out will actually reach and land with these folks. Also, you want to think about how you're going to prioritize your targets. So based on your, program needs, are there any dates that should be considered when you're prioritizing your targets, right? So for example, we were doing some bilingual texting. So we had to think about a couple of different things like region, who we're speaking to, things like that when we are targeting. Also, folks, when it comes to prioritizing your targets, what I didn't mention is that there are various tools that you can use to assist with that process. So, for example, with us, we did have a DigiOrg calendar that gave us a guide to let us know what we're going to be targeting and when. Also, you want to make sure that you're being adaptable and flexible, just because there can be different changes to policies or things that are ever evolving. So that might affect who you're targeting and when you are targeting those folks. Also, folks, we definitely use Airtable, which served as a really great tool for us to be able to request our list, to chase our list, to keep ourselves organized with our overall data studio. Now, also, folks, I highly recommend that you consult with your department leads to finalize your targets and also to make sure that your lists are aligning with whatever programmatic goals that you have. And last but not least, folks, you really want to think about how you are going to, manage your data. So a pro tip is you should really minimize the number of people that are handling your list uploading. However, if you do plan to have multiple people uploading lists, just make sure that they are consistent with things like your naming conventions and really keeping a close track of what lists are being uploaded and when they are being completed. You also want to make sure that you are working with your external stakeholders as a big part of this process. So that can be other directors, your expansion teams, coalition teams, or your, battleground states, for example. So I know that was a lot of information. Once again, folks, if you do have questions, please go ahead and let us know in the chat. I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Carolina, who's going to talk about people power.
Thanks, Brianna. So you can send a lot of texts to a lot of people. We know that. But what actually makes texting beautiful and effective is the fact that people are reaching out to other people. And it comes down to our ability to support our volunteers to do that work. If we have scripts, doesn't matter how many scripts we have, if our volunteers don't feel supported and have the structures to use them, if we have many, many different tasks and many, many different drop-off points, if we're not addressing those drop-off points, finding ways to hear from our people, to really treat our volunteers as stakeholders themselves, a texting platform, just a texting program cannot scale, and it cannot have effective messaging. So your power is your people, and in recognizing that empowering them is one of the greatest things you can do in a texting program. So there were two questions we kind of asked ourselves when designing this program from the beginning. And one was, is this tool necessary for our work to really have an impact, for it to survive, right? And like texting is a very effective mobilization tool for volunteer recruitment, but how do you keep volunteers engaged in recruiting other volunteers, right? While texting is very appealing, it's a low barrier, in many ways accessible way to start becoming engaged. It's addictive, it's easy to gamify, right? But that's one of the exciting things about texting, that you can reach new people, you can engage and excite new people with this tool. But how do you keep them engaged? How do you even get them to the tool? And these were questions that we had to think a lot about, because as we scaled, new problems just emerged over and over again. And people are not going to want to just click and send the same message over and over again, right? So finding ways to get feedback from our volunteers, listening to them, hearing what they needed, the support structures that they needed, this was absolutely critical for us to retain and show that we respect and are listening to our volunteers. Now that brings me to my second point, which was the second consideration was, when we're using this tool, is if it's necessary for us to survive, if we really do believe that this kind of mobilization tool is important, then how can we ensure that our use of it is always strengthening our community values, right? Recognizing that volunteers are not just clickety-clicketers, right? But that they, right, are the ones having these conversations. They are the ones empowering others across the country. That this is an opportunity we all have. The texting is kind of a laboratory. It may just be volunteer recruitment, but even in that act, there is such great opportunity to teach and to listen. And the thing is about texting that I think is really important to consider is that it's very freeing medium, right? You don't hear a voice, you don't see a face, you can send thousands of messages in a few minutes, you can get that adrenaline rush of getting lots and lots of replies at once. This creates a very freeing situation, both for voters and for volunteers. Voters will say all kinds of things to our volunteers, sometimes really, really terrible things to our volunteers. And volunteers in that moment, you know, texting is quite a bit like, for many, it's quite a bit like reaching out to friends on a phone. That that difference doesn't always translate, and there's a lot that can happen in texting, a lot of risk that can happen, risk to the volunteer, right? We have to think a lot about how do we protect our volunteers, and also how do we protect the voter, right? So thinking about throughout our structure, where is the potential for great freedom and empowerment, and where is the potential for great risk, and finding ways to address that throughout our volunteer pipeline and also through our scripting and through other mechanisms was critical for us. All right, so the first way to support the volunteer that was really, really, really very important to us was the training, recruiting and training. Now with texting, in our case, we didn't have to do any active recruitment, right? People just wanted to text. Why is that? It's a very interesting question, right? How can we make something of that enthusiasm for texting? I mean, should texting have a future? What about that can we reflect upon and activate in the future? But so recruitment was not so much a concern. But training was a real question for us, because texting is a complicated process. You have to figure out how to use this website in order to communicate with others in a digital space where you're not in a room with other people, right? That's tough too, because you're not just texting voters, you're texting other texters and texting other moderators and volunteers and staff the entire time in our digital space. So finding ways to mitigate those effects and create as much of a human experience, like a whole human experience for everyone who's involved, was something we had to think about. How do we keep people engaged and interactive and not feeling like just passive receptors of information throughout this experience, so that they talk to their friends and get their friends to join the program and teach each other, right? And build that structure of empowerment for themselves, right? So thinking about the training, we ended up making a mandatory live training. I think there are many, many, many different ways one could go about this. The mandatory live training on Zoom had many pluses, but also many, many minuses, because not everyone is familiar with Zoom. Zoom is not entirely accessible in many, many ways. And so if you're going to use Zoom, you need to get it captioned, right? You need to think about, how can I make this piece of technology that not everybody knows how to use, if I'm going to make it mandatory, how can I make it as easy as possible for everyone to get onto it? So we had to think about this. I think we also had to think about, well, learning is not an instantaneous process. So one Zoom, even if it's super interactive, with a little quiz, and even if you're asking questions and engaging with the chat, not everybody's going to pay attention for the whole Zoom call. A lot of people will leave it on and move or get a phone call. Also, not everybody learns by listening to a presentation in a digital space. So thinking about then, what other resources can we provide? What kind of written documentation can we provide? What kinds of other support structures can we provide in the form of office hours and face-to-face interactions to help different kinds of learners get into the door and begin to feel comfortable and set up for success to do this work? Okay, so I can go over briefly what the general volunteer onboarding looked like. The way it worked was people would sign up for a training, and then they would use Mobilize to get a Zoom link, and then the Zoom app, if they could find the Zoom link, they would attend that training. And then at the end of the training, we shared links to a skills assessment, to an onboarding guide that walked through all the steps, and of course to a feedback form, because hearing about what volunteers liked about the training and what wasn't working for them was also incredibly important. So we had them do this skills assessment. At the end of the skills assessment, the link to our Slack was produced. And based on the score in the skills assessment, folks would either get access to Slack or not. So, and you could take the skills assessment as often as you wanted. This changed too. So at the end, anyone would get the Slack link. So then they'd get access to Slack, but this was already also, this is also another drop-off point. Slack was not always accessible because we have to refresh the link. So getting access to Slack, there was a lot of drop-off here. People would get access to Slack, then they'd get lost in Slack. So we needed to think about how do we get people to our channels so that they can get the guidance for next steps and begin texting. So as you can see, there's a lot of different steps here. You have to figure out how to get to the virtual training. You have to do this skills assessment, which is a Google form. It was a 10-question quiz, which also included community guidelines and values. If the person did not accept our community guidelines and values, they could not take the quiz. And the skills assessment changed with time, right? So they take this quiz, and then at the end, the quiz would give them a Slack link. They join the Slack. They had onboarding written documentation. Still, a lot of folks got lost in Slack. So figuring out how do I make sure that people, once they're in Slack, find us with Slack bots, with additional other tools. They get into the channels, specifically into a channel called Text New Texters. That's where they would get guidance either from a human being or from a robot, and I'll talk about that a little. And then from there, they got access to our private texting channels to begin texting. So there are a lot of different steps and drop-off points that we had to consider. And if we go to the next slide, what you can see is, right, there's a lot of different forms of technology here. And I added email because many people between the Mobilize and the Zoom and the Slack needed additional guidance. So having email access was, having an email that they could find was really important. Also because Mobilize does not, the confirmation emails aren't always easily findable for folks. So one of the very first things we realized we needed to do was really staff up this onboarding process with volunteers who understood what it was like to go through this process so that they could compassionately, kindly, patiently help these folks through this process. And at the end, you see we have this picture of ROB. We automated some of this because for scale reasons, it became too much even to do with the volunteer team, all of it. But if you go to the next slide, you'll see that we ended up staffing up our trainings. We had many trainings, and we had volunteers who were specially instructed and trained and had gone through a lot of vetting to do these trainings on Zoom, and who could explain to texters what the next steps were with great clarity. We also staffed up an email inbox with volunteers. And then we had special volunteers called greeters who were just right there in Slack, able to answer questions, knew basically what all of the common first questions were, all of the big troubleshooting issues, and were able to walk people through that. And ultimately, Rob also helped with this process. Okay, so that was the first consideration. How do we get people in? How do we set them up for success? How do we address the multitude of issues that people face in even getting onto a digital workspace like Slack and then onto a digital tool like through text? So the next thing we had to consider was that texting, it has a pretty complex life cycle. Staff build a campaign, but then you have to get all of those initials sent. And through texts, the tool that we use did not have an automated process to get people into a campaign. So we had to have a special team of experienced moderators ensure that people could get into campaigns in through text and were able to send initial messages. We had this team also just checking the progress of initials so that they could replace, so that they knew when we needed to move on to the next campaign. This is important because otherwise volunteers experience pauses between campaigns. So to create a seamless experience for volunteers so they weren't frustrated, one of the greatest forms of frustration for volunteers is not being able to text. We set up all kinds of systems to ensure that assigning was a smooth process. Now, once people get their initials, they're in a campaign, they're sending their texts, they have a lot of questions. This has to do with the sheer complexity of a texting website, right? There are all these scripts. People don't necessarily read the scripts. They don't even know necessarily that scripts are there. Many people are working on mobile phones or on tablets. A lot of people are seniors. Many people have never done this before. They think texting is just like texting a friend on their phone. So there was quite a bit of confusion that needed to be managed and support that needed to be provided. People need to know, if I'm asking a question, I'm going to get an answer. And we had specialized volunteers in a specialized Slack channel just for questions, working to ensure that these volunteers were supported. These volunteers knew the scripts extremely well and were able to guide people also when there weren't scripts. And given the fact that texting is written, it's a written medium, it's a picture that can circulate very easily in the internet. This is a kind of risk that's unique to texting in some sense. Right? Viral tweets about our texts were something that happened. So captains were also responsible for making sure that people felt supported and understood what our guidelines were as a community so that they could respond personally, right? So that they could personalize with, they felt empowered to have real conversations, but at the same time were not feeling so frustrated that they'd start yelling at a voter, right? So captains were really, really important for the psychological health of the texting program. Now, the thing is that, as I've said, learning is not an instantaneous process. One Zoom training is not going to work for everyone. So a lot of lessons are just not learned until you're doing it, right? A lot of people learn by doing. I'm somebody who learns by doing. And we realized that we needed to go through conversations to find ways to continue to support our volunteers throughout this process. And the role that did this work was sweepers. Sweepers went through campaigns after all the initial messages had been sent. They read conversations. What we ended up doing was that once sweepers had read conversations, and if they thought, wow, this person's doing really great texting, they have such great persuasive skills, really love it, they'd send them positive feedback and we'd just be like, you're awesome. We also created a second questions channel where we would promote some of these people so that they had a community where they could they could ask questions and answer each other's questions too, as well as receive support from captains. Our sweepers would also go through every first texters campaign. So if somebody just started, they'd go through those texts and then they'd use this as a teaching opportunity to say, hey, I saw you just started. You're so welcome to this team. Amazing to have you here. And they would then also note, like, I noticed that you didn't opt out this person. Opting out is complicated. I always keep the guide open. So they'd share resources and help create literacy about our program and about the channels in these conversations. Sweepers also, however, would find risky conversations, conversations where volunteers would say things like, you're the Antichrist, or you can't be saved, or we had trolls, right? And so sweepers would find these volunteers, and in some cases we would try to mediate, find out what's going on. We recognize that people are angry. A lot of people are here because they care a lot and are frustrated. And so finding ways to turn every single interaction like that into a teaching opportunity where we could see good intentions was part of what the sweeping program did. We would reach out with constructive feedback. We'd call these people. And we did as much as we could to create a culture around positive, supportive feedback for our texters to help with retention, but also to ensure that everyone was on the same page about our values. And then finally, so it was very, very important to us that voters received responses. Just very, very important that they receive timely responses. This is in part because the quicker you respond to someone, the more likely they are to reply back. But it's also partly just because it is on our values to respond to every single person who chooses to engage with us. So we had a special team of closers, and through text, this is a process that is quite complicated, and it's much simpler in other texting platforms. But we had to develop a great deal of documentation and processes to do this. But we did it with our volunteers. This was a volunteer-led operation that managed to pull up replies and ensure that thousands, in fact, really, really thousands a day, sometimes 100,000 a day, 200,000 a day, were reassigned back into the pool to get quick responses from our volunteers. And closers would do this they would do this every single day in a campaign until the campaign stopped yielding responses. And then once it stopped yielding responses, we would archive that campaign. So that was our volunteer leader structure. We also had many other volunteer leaders in Text Me Gente. And one other thing that was really critical for us was, because we scaled so much, we needed to have a hierarchy. So we as staff there was a point where we could no longer answer all moderator questions. And so we created a front-end lead position and a back-end lead position. Back-end leads were those who focused on assigning, sweeping, and closing, and front-end leads focused on volunteer-facing activities like answering questions. And this structure was really important because it allowed us to really hear the feedback from our leaders, from some of our most experienced and dedicated volunteers. It gave them the ability to see for themselves where we needed structures. They built their own scripts, they built their own systems. And it was a way for us to also create new trainings, right? Our leads led their own office hours, they led their own workshops, they taught each other about persuasive techniques and what is an effective conversation. And they led their own Zoom parties for front-end leads and for back-end leads. And so creating that structure was critical for us in the end. All right, and I believe there is a volunteer pipeline slide. One more slide, I believe. Yes. So how did folks become moderators? Well, we would have them text for 2 weeks, at least, and then they could fill out an application. The application was shared in our Slack channels. We had virtual trainings. These were calls where we would talk about our values, talk about what we hoped to accomplish with the various moderator roles. This ended up being split out over time to focus on specific kinds of roles. And in some cases, we had 2 mandatory trainings. At the end of these, the potential moderators would take an assessment, and based on the assessment, we would reach out, give them access to our mod channels in Slack, to documentation about the different roles, to create a support structure and to ensure that nobody was feeling like tossed straight into the pit. We had a mod and training program. So for the first 2 shifts, moderators would have in their name, I'm a mod in training, and that they would have special posts from leads where they could check in and where they could ask questions. After 2 shifts as a mod in training, one was a moderator, and we encouraged our moderators to continue growing, building skills, developing by attending office hours, going to workshops, asking questions, filling out a daily post-shift report, and using workspaces to give us suggestions about scripts and other things. And then by learning by doing, our moderators would also, our leads would also nominate other leads, and in this way the program continued to grow. And finally, just how did we all communicate with one another? Well, when we wanted to create an event where we wanted to make sure as many people could sign up as possible, we'd create a Mobilize event. We'd do internal Mobilize events for our trainings for mods. There was quite a bit of email. Most of our meetings were to create a sense of in-person communication, were over Zoom or Meet. We had a number of different Slack channels for a number of different communicative purposes. We tried to create accountability with a staffing calendar and with other ways to check in so that everyone knew I'm on shift right now, I'm leaving right now. And we had a number of workspaces where we could track each other's work and stay in communication. And so now I'm going to pass on to Clarice.
Thank you so much, Carolina. And Carolina, we always we give her so much reverence because she was the very first of the text team and knows this process in and out better than anyone else, and did such a wonderful job cultivating a space for our volunteers and our moderators and our mod leaders. So thank you again, Carolina, and thank you for walking us through that. No one else could not have done could not have done it without you. So I am gonna bring us on home with our toolkit. So you want to think through, like, what tools will you need. We also ultimately want you to be able to go and start up a text program, whether this is going to be with the state specific Democratic Party, or if this is going to be with another organization or a PAC, a nonprofit, wherever you may go, or even just within your own community, you want to set up a text program. We're going to talk about the toolkit and the tools that you'll need, and just kind of what our toolkit was overall. So next slide, please. Okay, what are the core responsibilities of our team? Example for us, obviously, building text campaigns and managing the volunteer teams. That is a huge and was the primary responsibility of the team. What you want to think about and think through as you are building your toolkit are what are going to be the responsibilities of your team. Um, Building text campaigns and managing the volunteer teams were the two biggest pieces. As Carolina just showed you all, there were a lot of nuanced and tiered structures that went into supporting the volunteer teams as well as our text programs. Next slide. What role will your volunteers play in executing your strategy? So will they just be sending text messages? Will they be building the campaigns? Will they be doing or hosting trainings for you? Will they be recruiting volunteers? All of these things are going to be different depending on your needs and what you have, depending on the needs of your program. So for us, we did, our volunteers did a little bit of everything. They did not build the campaigns because that gets into a security issue space. However, we had volunteers that managed sending the text messages. Sorry, you all, because I did not mute my Slack, and let me do that right now because it will continue to bing, because we're still sending text messages as a program right now. All right, so and then I just lost the Zoom because that's what happens. There we go. So think through what role the volunteers will play in your strategy. How do you plan to use your volunteers? The more you can distribute work for your texting program, the better. Things to consider, like I said, security. Do you want your volunteers having access to all of your data, to all of the information, or just a little bit? Because was a really large campaign with millions and millions of voter data, targets, and information being shared out. We did not have volunteers that built the campaigns because we didn't give them access to our groups and our universes. However, if you are running a text program for a smaller group, maybe you have 3 or 4 trusted volunteers, or even one volunteer that's their specialty. And I'll change that. We had a fully vetted volunteer that came on during GOTV that had gone through um, the vet process from the DNC, and he became someone who started to build campaigns, but he built one specific type of campaign every day. And so there's the possibility for you to have that type of support. But just think through, what are things that you would have them do? What type of volunteers does your program have? Are they consistent? Are they transient? Do you have to continue to recruit them? Because this was the DNC, we had a very consistent flow of volunteers that were coming in. At some organizations, you don't necessarily have consistent volunteers. You have new vols at every event, or just vols that are there for a few months and then kind of trickle out and a new cycle comes in. So you'll want to think about that. And you'll also want to think through how you're planning to send text. Are you going to be shifting these things with your volunteers like we would a field program or like door knocks or canvassing? Or would you like to host events like text banking and friend banking where these texts will be getting sent at one time? All of those things will help you figure out how you want to navigate and plan to use your volunteers in your strategy in your program. Now, what daily tasks will be necessary for your team to function efficiently? I cannot stress enough some type of daily meeting and consistent communication channels. We use Slack, which is the example that we have on the slide. We use Slack as a team, as a consistent way of communicating. We have our text team thread. We would really encourage threading within the text team channel because there were a lot of conversations where by noon, the things that we talked about at 9 o'clock that morning had just disappeared off of the channel because there was so much happening. But that was the primary space where we as a team could communicate with one another as staff as well as our volunteers. And then daily meetings, having a daily stand up, having a daily checkout, doing, I used to do midday report outs in the Slack channel as well, or multiple times a day of checkouts and reminders and flags and announcements. But just making sure you have that structure where you're communicating, specifically because we are all working virtually right now. And I muted one Slack channel, but neglected to mute the other three. Apologies, you all, because we have 3 Slack channels. Just so to put that in context about consistent communication, we have our staff Slack, we have a volunteer Slack, and then we also have a lead Slack workspace specifically for our lead moderators, to make sure that we have clear, concise spaces for communication happening across the board. Another thing that we use, oh, sorry, Brandon, just real quick, Carolina spoke to this, but just want to add that having those feedback sessions, feedback and workshop sessions with volunteers is extremely important as well. Also within the team, we had meetings that would happen weekly, such as Breaking Bad, which is where we would come together and think through all the things that could go wrong or could break over the course of the campaign. And we would just try and troubleshoot for things that had not happened yet. A writer's room, where we would come together and discuss certain scripting issues or things that we needed to write scripts for, making sure we had the most up-to-date recommended replies and messaging, and then also tool time, to a meeting where we specifically talked about our tools and what things we were using in the automations and how those were working, and also a volunteer meeting, called it Vol Volley, and we just would come together to discuss how are we creating community. So having these spaces also helps to have them with your staff as well as with the volunteers. Using Google Sheets for Workspace, at one point, because we have so many volunteers and so many moderators, we exceeded the capacity to add people to Google Sheets and or Google Docs, and had to transition into a Google group. So thinking through all of those things, how are you going to continue to communicate? Sorry, go ahead, Brianna. The other thing you would want to work through for your toolkit, how will you create outbound scripts? Scripting is a huge part. We had wonderful Carolina, who wrote the vast majority of our issue-based replies, and really was like the lead manager around our scripting process with our initials. But you'll want to think through, how will this be delegated? How will this be handled? Where will the scripts live? We had a script library that was a Google Sheet. Where will you gather information for your messaging? What messaging are you sending out? Having all of those things in one place. We knew that we had, with this campaign, things change daily, and we're talking things changing daily and from state to state to state. So there were certain docs that we had from like a top line voter contact from the states for battlegrounds and non-battlegrounds, information from voter protection, Google Sheets from that. I believe Carolina and the rest of the team pulled a lot of information from the messaging guidance we would get from Dan Parnes or from the public comms that would go out on Twitter or other social media accounts, news articles, things that had been shared and said from the campaign. We were able to pull and use for scripting. So you'll want to think about, where is this messaging coming from? And also, how can you create a space where comms, policy, data, and digital all meet to discuss what is happening with the text, with your scripting? Because a text script is going to be vastly different from a call script, or how you would do a narrative for social media, how you, and just so on and so forth, and changes based off of what you were trying to accomplish as well. Okay, I know we have already gone 5 minutes over, and I really appreciate you all staying. And I know you have another meeting to go to. So I'm going to go through the next few slides as quick as I can, and want to make sure that we have space for you all as well to ask questions. I also see you all asking questions in the chat, and appreciate that. If you have any, drop those there. So how do you track and build and delegate campaigns? Google Sheet is going to be your best friend. Having a campaign build tracker that will allow you to have visibility on everything from the QA process, who the campaign owner is, what the status is on that campaign, what it may be needed to get that campaign completely built out. We're talking, it was very detailed for us towards the end, because we were starting to navigate 22 campaigns a day. So we needed to know who was owning building the campaign, had they written the script, if they did write the script and it had been QA'd, who was the person that was QAing it, who was the person that was going to, when were the edits being added from that initial QA, when it had gone through a second QA. Once that second QA was finished, when was it going through the campaign launcher? Once it had gone through the launcher, when was it being QA'd again? Any changes, a second QA. All of that was tracked in a Google Sheet. We also used Airtable to make the initial assignment and communicate any information from external stakeholders about what needed to happen in the campaign, the purpose of it, as well as communicating with Nina to get data coming in and going out for that campaign. And then our automations. We've talked a little bit about it, and we could not have accomplished this campaign without the support from Isaac and the engineering team, Elliot and Caitlin with our tools team, and then also just the weekly meetings with Get Through, around through text, and the things that they were able to do. Carolina spoke about Rob, which automated our greeting process, and Rob greeted thousands of people and onboarded them into the program, which was wonderful. Isaac's team created Rob. They also worked with us to create sweeper links and assignment links to make it just a one click for people to be able to get access through APIs. They created links that utilized API functions on the back end of Through Text to make that a one-click process. Also, Elliot and Caitlin and Nina collabed to use Civis to create a campaign launch report for us that completely allowed us to automate the build process of campaign building. We're talking millions of targets going out for one campaign. Through Text has its limits for how many groups can be uploaded, et cetera, all of this other stuff that I would love to walk you through. But just know, campaign building went from being a 4 to 5 hour process to a 30-minute upfront process and a click of a button and then some edits. And then also working with Through Text to get bulk reassigning. Okay, next slide. Debrief. Break it all the way down for you all. What were we trying to accomplish? We were trying to win. We were trying to execute and support. And I just realized that somehow the slides did not update from what I updated them. So I am going to apologize in advance that what you're about to see is not what's supposed to be there. What were we trying to accomplish? Execute and support the DNC direct voter contact goals for the 2020 presidential cycle to mobilize as many voters as possible to win elections for Democrats up and down the ballot. Navigating 2020 with COVID and not being able to do in-person direct voter contact the way that we've done in the past, this was a huge part of why texting was so pivotal and so impactful and so necessary. We needed to we set a goal of sending around 100 million messages because we felt like that 100 million was what was going to be needed in order to have an impact. And we were able to see that. Next slide. And this is not right either, but sorry, y'all. I don't think it updated. Okay. What happened? Biden and Harris won. We sent over 150 text messages. How did we do that? Testing the limits of every system and tool that we had through our people power and through transparency, truth, and honesty within our team. We trusted the process. We were flexible and open to adapting the processes daily, all the way up until election day. If we had to make a change, we made those changes in the moment, very rapid response, recognizing the newness of this type of campaign voter experience, and then accepting our mistakes and failures, because there were going to be mistakes, there were going to be failures when scaling something this big that had never been done before. Texting's been around for a while, but it has never been used in the way that it has for a presidential campaign before 2020. Next slide. So yeah, this one didn't update either. Sorry. And I will make sure that when this gets sent out that you all have the updated slides. I deeply apologize. Not sure what happened here, but what should be here is what was successful. We had consistent volunteer engagement. We sent over 150 million text messages. We launched a successful bilingual program, Text Mi Gente, that was able to text into Texas, Pennsylvania, Arizona, and Nevada in a culturally relevant way that impacted field margins. We sent campaigns that had minimal errors. When you're sending 10 million text messages in one day, that's 10 million people that you are sending information to. You want to make sure that it is the most up-to-date, the most accurate information as possible. So having minimal errors was a big part of it. Catching errors, which was also a part of that tiered volunteer structure, was part of how we were able to make sure people got the correct information. And then having quality conversations. Reply rates stayed between 8 and 12% for most of our campaigns, for our voter contact campaigns. And that showed that we were having fruitful conversations, which is also a part of having recommended replies that foster and engage and encourage conversation back and forth, that allow the person you're reaching out to know that there's a real person on the other side, which is the advantage of a peer-to-peer campaign versus a blast SMS. Next slide. How can we grow from this experience? We can grow from this experience by knowing that we motivated people, that they can do anything they put their minds to. Texting can and does empower everyone. It is an inclusive tool that should be used to support campaign efforts, no matter how big or small. It is a way to get everyone and anyone involved and engaged. It's a way to get your message out there. And we've learned that it can be a powerful and effective tool when used well and responsibly. Next slide. And then questions, knowing that we have 3 minutes and deeply apologizing for that going over.
I have a question.
Yes.
And by the way, big fan of Text Team. You guys are amazing. Consistently impressed. When I try and think about if I were to be in a situation doing this in a next campaign, I'd be curious about like, what are the skills that you would recommend your team have? And like, yeah, what are helpful skills for people to already come in with?
The most helpful skill to, and this is just from my perspective, would be an open mind and flexible and able to rapid respond, because you are texting and it's like this immediate instant gratification that people can get either from the texter or the person sending the the person receiving the text message. You need to be able to think quick and on your feet. And if there's not a recommended reply, how do you navigate answering this? If this thing breaks in the middle of sending these messages, but they all need to go out in the next hour, and that is a hard deadline, will you have the capacity to just figure out what needs to happen and troubleshoot and move forward, and then like address building later? So really having that open mind, being flexible, and rapid response, like crisis strong crisis resolution skill set is certainly helpful. And then also just consistency. I'm a big fan of bringing on volunteers that show up consistently and like put in the work. When it's a volunteer, that lets me know that they will be just as consistent and put in the work when it's something they're being asked to do and being paid for.
Thank you.
Very welcome. Any other questions? And I will make sure that you all get the updated slide deck and the handout. I know that it's 1:00 and or 2:00 now, and there's another presentation kicking off, and want to allow you all to go to that as well. If you have any questions, please feel free to Slack. My email, you can email me personally. I'll drop it in the chat. My personal email is just my first and my last name at Gmail, ClarysChris@gmail. So grateful that you all were able to be here. Extremely grateful, thankful for Brianna and Carolina and everything that they were able to do over the cycle. If anyone else has any questions, please just let us know. You all are super welcome. It was a lot, and we tried to get it all in there under the wire, but as you can see, text program was a very detailed and nuanced robot machine run by people power, wonderful people. All right, well, we will bid you all adieu. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful day.